Hail Mizahar, hail Felavik, and hail anyone on the internet who seems to be found themselves to the Mizahar vlog section of YouTube. Anyways, right now I'm going to read a thread that Felavik wants me to read. It's called The Redhead Monkey. I have not read it. I've actually read the first 2 lines, to be honest, and I haven't read any of the rest. So I'm just going to read it word from word, and I might mess up, but I'm not a pro. This is my first time. Anyways, here we go. The Redhead Monkey. 28th Spring, 5:13 AV, 11th bell. It was calm for the moment, the spring having finally begun to grasp hold of Riverfall, or at least in the mind of the young Inarta, at least. Winter for her, however, had seemed to have lasted longer than normal. To her, it had begun since the Dejud storm, this ever-looming darkness and worry hovering not above her and the land. But that may have just been her. She took careful steps around the park, her eyes watching the Akalax train upon the grass and practice their combat, whilst others seemed to take a more peaceful approach. Sammy, however, had been set up upon something else that day. As soon as she saw it, the girl had made a beeline for it. Her target had been sighted, and she had laid claim to it. Within the inner half was a particular tree that had captivated the mind of the young Inarta, that her mind would not shift from it. It was turned into a foe that she had to be defeated, one that she had to overcome, and in the only way she knew how. Upon the tranquil grass, she stared up into the budding branches, the thin blossom having coated it, her eyes tracing the broad branches down to the base before returning up to the branches above her. Sammy reached up to them, standing upon her toes as she stretched up, her fingers barely touching the rough bark. She rocked back down to her feet, hands going to her hips in annoyance. It was going to be harder than she previously thought. Not that it was going to stop her. She went around the edge of it, raising her foot in places and pressing it against the trunk in places, whilst her eyes continued to search for a way up. She pressed her weight once more, gripping this time onto a slightly lower branch and tugging at it. Her lips pursed, a small frown having formed its way there. She extended both of her hands up above her and raised her legs so she swung on the branch for a mere chime, then released. The strain on her arms caused them to ache, the muscles on her hands twitching after the awkward grip she had on them. But it did not stop her from continuing. She knew she needed speed in order to begin scaling this tree, and so that is what she would use. Sammy pulled herself back from the base, giving her space to run at it. Her eyes locked upon the branch, shoulders hunching in her toes, ready to push her off before she did. She gave a grunt as she leapt at it, arms out to catch at it before she smacked against the ground. Her eyes clenched shut for a moment as she hung there, suspended, her arms having wrapped their way around the branch and her toes hovering mere inches from the ground. She cautiously looked down, eyebrow raised slightly in surprise. A grin flashed on her face as she swung there for a while, and her mind tried to work out the rest of the way up. Felavik was out in full garb today, his lacan sheathed on his belt and his body protected by flexible leather armor. He was on patrol. Sort of. His shift had ended about an hour ago, but in all honesty, he had nothing else to do. His life was training and patrolling and sparring and training and patrolling and guarding and training and sparring and patrolling. How much would his life change if he did an extra few hours of one? Felavik's route, for one man was not expected to patrol the entire city at any one time, took him into and around the inside of Kinnaran Gardens. After all, crime did not stop just because there were more trees. It was Felavik's favorite route to take for the reason Kinnaran Gardens was easily the most peaceful place in the entire city. That wasn't to say it wasn't lively. Kids played, older kids sparred, men meditated and sparred, women even were found relaxing in the shade. It was this sort of peace and happiness that Felavik donned his leather armor for in the morning. As he strode through the beautiful garden, secretly wishing his armor didn't soak up the sun's rays as well as it did, he spotted a pair of boots hanging from a tree. Then he spotted some shins, maybe a bit of knee too. Felavik frowned and made a beeline for the tree. The closer he got, the more of the girl he could see, for it was in fact revealed to be a woman, well, a girl, for her age, and odd clothing. She could just make out the ginger hair of the Inarta. When finally he was more or less below her, he looked up and called, "What in Riverfall are you doing, young miss?" Oddly enough, Felavik and the boys his age had never done such things when they were younger. Akalaks had an affinity for the earth, and the further from it they were, the more nervous it made them. Sammy's legs swung as she struggled to pull herself higher up, her waist having now pressed itself against the branch, her arms wrapped around it as she caught her breath, her cheeks aglow with the activity. She continued to flail for a bit, using all the strength she could muster to drag herself up. She raised a leg up and threw it over the branch and let out a long gasp as she readied herself. Dang. I fucking got lost. For a while she simply sat, soaking in the sun rays through the leaves whilst her fingers locked themselves onto the branch, or at least until she saw the blue giant hovering beneath her. The girl blinked down at him, her head tilting slightly as she tried to understand his tongue. She leaned herself down slightly, her head coming level with the branch, whilst her legs secured themselves onto it. "What does it look like I'm doing, Mr. Blue? I'm climbing, of course." That's terrible. Her head turned upwards once more, and her arm reached out for a branch above her. Focus covered most of her face as she gave it a firm tug and pulled away the moment it released a cracking note. Her lips pursued and her eyes turned into another one, before repeating the same procedure. She gave a heavy sigh when she could not find one that did not groan, and so a pout covered her face, though only for a tick at most. "You're one of the Akalak, aren't you?" She looked down at him with an element of curiosity on her face. She had seen the Akalak before, but she had yet to actually stop and talk to one of them properly outside of conversations that were of official importance. Her back leaned against the main trunk of the tree, her fingers now having claimed a spindly and inner branch that was bent down to her. Her fingers traced the buds and blossoms, closing in on occasion to study the petals up close before finally she released it. Those bright blue eyes turned down once more to the Akalak. "So why all the armor? You all warriors here or something? Felavik watched the girl's antics with more curiosity. He had, as previously mentioned, never witnessed someone climbing a tree before, and to him it looked like interesting work. He could admire the methodical way the girl seemed to move, and the strength she displayed to keep herself in place. It occurred to him that perhaps the root goal of such an exercise was indeed to exercise the task gave. It looked to him like a challenge both mental and physical proportions, and with completing it, one would strengthen both. Mr. Blue, the acolyte repeated in his head. That was a new one. Of course, non-acolyte children were always prone to mentioning the blueness, but she seemed a bit too old for him for such immature observations. Whatever the case, it bothered Felavik little. She wasn't actually acting maliciously, after all. Felavik was so taken aback by the first question that she had already asked the second and third before he could collect his wits. Well, yeah, I am an acolyte, and we are all warriors, he replied shortly, unsure what else to say. After a few moments he followed up with, Every citizen of Riverfall is required to be trained in the event of an emergency, not just an acolyte.